Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, distinguished participants, it's a pleasure and honor to be here today with you. Unfortunately, my Director General, Mr. William Lacy-Swing, had confirmed his participation, but unfortunately he was invited to an important meeting in Brussels on Libya. So he had to leave this morning, and I'm grateful that Ambassador Jazairi has accepted that I deliver on behalf of my Director General a statement on this occasion. But anyway, his meeting in Brussels actually is related to the topic we're discussing today, because it's almost the same issue, and I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the recent developments on Libya, the situation of the refugees and migrants, and the collective efforts by the international community, mostly IOM and other UN agencies, with the African Union and the EU to deal with this emergency. From the outset, I would like to thank the Geneva Center for Human Rights Advancements and Global Dialogue on their initiative to organize this panel debate. The theme for this conference closely reflects IOM's own vision, namely that violence and insecurity, as well as climate change, migration, have adversely affected millions of people in the MENA region and have become issues of high importance for the countries in the region and in Europe. We live in an era of unprecedented human mobility, a period in which more people are on the move than ever before. Today, there are 244 million international migrants and approximately 750 million internal migrants in the world, 1 in 7 of the global population. This volume of modern migration is in itself an important indicator and an eye-opener to the situation occurring within and across borders. Displacement is one of the principal impacts of crisis. Every year, millions of people are forced to leave their homes, fleeing conflicts, violence, disasters, and the effects of climate change. And I'm glad that my colleague Diana Ionesco will brief you on the environmental activities of IOM in dealing with such crises later on today. Migration is a fact of life and a reality as old as humankind. In 2016, the number of internally displaced refugees and asylum seekers reached roughly 665 million, a record high. This growth was concentrated between 2012 and 2015, driven mainly by the Syrian conflict, along with other conflicts such as in Iraq, Yemen, Sub-Saharan Africa, and so on. In Syria alone, half of the country's population was displaced, including over 6 million internally and more than 5 million in neighboring countries, with repercussions also felt by home and host communities. As part of maximizing our engagement as IOM with the UN system, with the donors and with host governments, partners on disaster risk reduction, DRR, IOM has produced a strategic framework document on disaster risk reduction and resilience, covering the period 2017-2020, to align its support with the UN Plan of Action on DRR for resilience, covering prevention, preparedness, response, recovery, and partnerships. It is important to note that IOM has over 20 years of experience of implementing transition and recovery programs that move beyond humanitarian response by addressing the root causes of forced migration before, during, and after crisis through development-oriented intervention in crisis contexts. When addressing the root causes of forced migration before a crisis, it is important to note that in fragile and crisis contexts, migration drivers and decision-making are shaped by constantly evolving social, economic, political, security, and environmental factors that define the landscape of risk and opportunity for potential migrants, including the displaced. In instances where crisis and displacement can be forecast, there may be time to initiate preventive and preparatory measures that can mitigate the scope and scale of the emergency response and minimize risks and vulnerabilities. Preventive interventions seek to comprehensively address potential vulnerabilities and needs, foster resilience, and leverage existing strengths and capacities. Preparedness initiatives classically include contingency planning, stockpiling, coordination, arrangements, evacuation planning, public information, and associated training and field exercises, and can reduce the possibility of harm or loss and minimize risks and protection concerns associated with displacement. As part of IOM's commitment to seek viable prevention and progressive solutions to complex migration and displacement challenges, community stabilization initiatives are designed to address migration drivers and promote local capacity in order to mitigate or prevent the recurrence of displacement and irregular migration. When addressing the root causes of forced migration during a conflict, large-scale population influxes usually intensify pre-existing challenges, often in terms of economic pressures, unemployment, inflation, and reduced access to services. IOM focuses on inclusive approaches, considering local economic, social, cultural, security, and environmental dynamics, while at the same time targeting the population as a whole, thus avoiding perceptions of preferential treatment and further aggravating tensions with the hosting communities. If our efforts are preemptive, we can help mitigate potential impacts of protracted displacement situations, reduce aid dependency and the prevailing sense of limbo, and support the process of recovery. In this regard, it is important to stress that socioeconomic inclusion ensures that the displaced will not only be in a much better position to fully contribute to their host communities' economy and society, but also acquire skills and assets which will contribute to a more durable solution. After a conflict, some people return, some locally integrate, and for others, circular migration or other forms of mobility are the best solution. The proportions vary, influenced by a range of personal and contextual factors, including duration of stay away from home and the reasons that cause them to flee. IOM excels at effectively managing mobility and solutions and believes that it is crucial to promote voluntary, informed, and orderly movements in adherence to non-refoulement obligations. With regards to successful peace building, the reintegration of former combatants is recognized as a key factor addressing the need for immediate security and longer-term recovery in the transition from war to peace. IOM supports DDR efforts by focusing principally on successful reintegration, supporting former combatants to transition to civilian life, and by supporting communities to recovery, absorb, and support returning former fighters and other conflict-affected populations through socioeconomic recovery, social cohesion, programming, and a broad array of peace-building support interventions. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, it is important to recognize the benefits of managed migration and its role in addressing the better integration of humanitarian and development responses. We must all stand ready to aid migrants and ensure social inclusion into all policies. I would like to quote my Director General, Mr. William Lacy-Swing: "Migration is not a problem to be solved, but a human reality to be managed." I also would like to congratulate the Geneva Center for Human Rights Advancement and Global Dialogue for the timely hosting of this important debate and for inviting IOM to be part of it. Finally, I also would like to welcome His Excellency the Ambassador of Sudan, a good friend of IOM, and I'm really happy to have you with us today. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.